A man placed $50 million check on a table, not as a gift, not as charity, as a price. He slid the check across the polished mahogany, like it was nothing. Like the woman sitting across from him was nothing, and he smiled the smile of a man who had never once been told no. Her name was Grace. She was 27 years old. She worked 2 jobs. She had calluses on her hands from cleaning other people's homes, and a smile so quiet and so real that people often stopped and looked twice, wondering where they had seen that kind of peace before. The man's name was Victor Osei. He was the 6th wealthiest man on the continent. 3 private jets, a tower in Lagos that bore his name in gold letters 40 feet tall. He had shaken hands with presidents and made ministers tremble with a phone call. He had never met a woman like Grace, and Grace had never met a man who looked at her the way Victor looked at her, not with love, not with curiosity, but with the cold, quiet confidence of a buyer standing in a market, certain the price was only a matter of negotiation. He pushed the check closer. 50 million naira, he said. 1 evening, just dinner, and whatever the evening becomes. The restaurant was silent, the kind of silence that holds its breath, and Grace looked down at the check. She looked at all those zeros. She looked up at Victor Osei, this man with his gold cufflinks and his empire, and his absolute certainty, and she did something nobody in that restaurant expected. She laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a frightened laugh, a warm, clear, unashamed laugh, like she had just heard the most innocent joke from a child. Then she folded the check in half, placed it gently back in front of him, and said 4 words. 4 words that would change both of their lives forever. Before we continue, please like this video and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story. Now, let us go back, because to understand what Grace said, you must first understand who Grace was, and who Victor Osei really was beneath all that gold. Victor Osei had built his empire from almost nothing, and that almost was the most important word in his story. His father had been a tailor in Kumasi, a gentle man with nimble fingers and a failing business. Victor had watched his father work himself thin, watched the thread and the fabric and the care, and still watched the debt collectors come. He swore at 17 that he would never be powerless again, never be the man whose hands were full and whose pockets were empty. By 30, he had his first real estate holding. By 40, Osei Group had offices in 6 countries. B50 had everything a man could name. The penthouse overlooking Victoria Island, the black Rolls-Royce Cullinan that waited for him every morning like a loyal hound, the board of directors who deferred to him in every room. But the penthouse was quiet at night. That was the part the newspapers never wrote about. Victor Osei ate dinner alone 300 days of the year. His wife, Amara, had died 4 years ago. Quietly, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and lilies, holding his hand and telling him not to cry. He had not cried then. He had not cried since. Something in him had calcified in that room, hardened like a stone dropped into cold water, and in the years that followed he had filled the silence with acquisitions, with deals, with power, with everything except the one thing Amara used to give him: warmth. Grace Mensa had grown up in a 2-room apartment in Accra's eastern quarter, the eldest of 4 children. Her mother, Abina, cleaned offices at night and sold Kellawell from a cart during the day. Her father had left when Grace was 9, a departure that came not with a goodbye but with a missing coat and an empty drawer. Grace had watched her. Mother squared her shoulders the morning after and say, simply, "We continue." Grace had continued ever since. She cleaned houses on weekdays, 3 houses before noon. On weekends, she helped her neighbor, old Mama Essie, run a small chop bar where the agusi soup was so good that men came from 3 neighborhoods away. She was saving money. Slowly, carefully, coin by coin. She was saving to open a small restaurant of her own. She had a notebook, a blue notebook with a cracked spine, where she wrote the menu, every dish, every price, every dream. She was not looking for rescue. She was building. But something strange had begun 3 weeks before Victor Osei sat across from her with his check and his smile. It started with a photograph that Grace had been cleaning the home of Madame Celestine Botang, a wealthy widow, when she knocked a small framed photograph off the mantelpiece. She picked it up. It was a picture of a young couple, perhaps 30 years old, standing in front of a tailor shop. The man was slim, smiling, with nimble fingers interlaced with the woman's. The woman was looking not at the camera, but at the man with an expression so full of love it made Grace's chest ache. And the woman in the photograph, Grace stared at it. For a long time, the woman in the photograph looked exactly like Grace. She put the photograph back. She told herself it was a coincidence. Faces repeat in this world. She had heard that everyone has a twin somewhere on the earth, but she thought about it. For 3 days, she was still thinking about it. The afternoon, her phone rang with an unknown number, and a man's voice, deep, controlled, with the accent of someone who had learned to flatten his origins into something boardroom smooth, said, "Miss Mence, my name is Victor Osei. I believe we share a mutual acquaintance in Madame's. I would like to meet you for dinner." Grace had paused. "Where?" Because Victor said, and for just a moment she heard something crack beneath his polished voice, something almost like desperation. "I saw you from my car last week, outside Madame Celestine's compound. And I need to speak with you." C'est Sol have said no. Every sensible voice inside her said no. But then she remembered the photograph, the woman who looked like her, the tailor shop. She said yes. The restaurant he chose was in a part of Accra that Grace had only ever seen through taxi windows. Crystal glasses, white tablecloths, so stiff they could stand on their own. A waiter who pulled out her chair as if this were entirely normal. Victor Osei arrived in a charcoal suit and said nothing for a long moment after sitting down. He looked at her face with an intensity that was unsettling, not hungry, not unkind, but piercing, like a man trying to solve a puzzle he had given up on years ago. "You look like someone I knew," he finally said. "Who?" Grace asked. He looked away. "It doesn't matter. Let's have dinner." But it did matter. Grace could feel it mattering. It pressed against the air between them like something alive. The dinner was fine. The conversation was careful. Victor Osei was charming in the way of a man who has learned charm as a strategy, and Grace was pleasant in the way of a woman who has learned to navigate powerful men without giving herself away. They talked about food, about Accra, about his company, briefly, about her work, which he asked about with a genuine curiosity that surprised her. And then dessert came, and Victor reached into his jacket and placed the check on the table. 50 million naira. Grace stared at it. She felt the number the way you feel a physical blow, a tightening in the chest, a sudden heat behind the eyes. She understood what it meant. She understood what he was asking. She looked up at Victor Osei's face, and she saw, beneath the composure, beneath the gold and the certainty, she saw a man who was profoundly, terribly lost. She laughed, clear and warm and real. She folded the check and placed it back in front of him. And she said, "Tell me about the woman in the photograph." Time stopped. Victor Osei's face, the face that boardrooms feared, that ministers practiced smiling at that face, went completely still. "What photograph?" He whispered, "The one in Madame Celestine's house." Grace said gently, "The woman standing in front of the tailor shop. The one who looks like me." Victor's hand, resting on the white tablecloth, trembled. Just once. Then he pressed it flat. "How do you know about that photograph?" His voice was very quiet now. "'Cause I clean Madame Celestine's house every Thursday," Grace said. "And last week I knocked it off the mantelpiece, and I saw her face." She paused. Who was she? Victor Osei said nothing for 30 seconds. 30 full, heavy seconds, in which the restaurant moved around them like a river around two stones. Then he said, very softly, "Her name was Adwoa. She was the love of my life. Before Amara. Before everything. Grace felt something cold move through her. What happened to her? Victor looked down at the tablecloth. She disappeared. 30 years ago. I was 21. She was 19. She was pregnant. His jaw tightened, and one morning she was simply gone. Grace's heart was hammering now. She thought of her mother. She thought of her mother's face. She thought of a two-room apartment in eastern Accra, and a woman who sold Calawell and said, "We continue," and a father who had left when Grace was 9, except Grace had never known her real father's name. She thought of her mother's name. Her mother's name was Abina, but her full name, her full, formal, Christian name that appeared on old documents in the bottom of a suitcase, Grace had once found as a child, was Adwa, Abwa, Abina, Mensa, Ad. "Mr. Osei," Grace said, and her voice was steady, though everything inside her was not. "I think we need to have a very different conversation." She did not tell him that night. She was not certain enough. One name was not a history. One resemblance was not a fact. But on the drive home in the taxi, she had insisted on taking herself. Grace pressed her hands together in her lap and tried to breathe. Her mother had never spoken of a man before Grace's stepfather, the one who had left when Grace was 9. Abina Minsa was a woman built of forward motion. She did not look backward, did not linger in old rooms. Grace had always respected that. She had never pressed. Now she pressed. The next morning, a Saturday, Grace went to her mother's apartment. Before the Calawell cart came out, Abina was in the kitchen, her hair wrapped, humming something old and slow. She was 67 years old, and still moved like a woman who had decided, long ago, that tiredness was not a reason to stop. "Mama," Grace said. Abina turned. She saw her daughter's face. The humming stopped. "Sit down," Grace said. "You sit down," Abina said quietly. "You are the one who looks frightened." They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, where Grace had done homework as a child. Grace placed her hands flat on the table. "I need you to tell me about my father, my real father, not Solomon." Solomon was the man who had left, before Solomon. Abina's face did something complicated. Te. Lines around her eyes deepened. She looked down at her own hands. Strong hands, work-worn hands, hands that had made something from nothing for 4 decades, and she was quiet for a long time. "Why now?" she said finally. "Because," Grace said, "last week, a man named Victor Osei took me to dinner." The cup of tea in Abina's hand rattled against the table. "Mama, where did you meet him?" Abina's voice had become very small. "Through Madame Sel. He saw me, and he asked to meet me." Grace paused. "He told me about a woman named Adwoa, a woman who disappeared 30 years ago when she was 19 and pregnant." Abina stood up. She walked to the window. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up a rooster somewhere. A child's voice. The smell of charcoal smoke and morning air. "Mama," Grace said softly. "Am I his daughter?" Silence. Then Abina turned, and her face was wet. "I was 19, she said. "He was 21. He was brilliant and beautiful, and his family had nothing. But he had plans, Grace. He had such plans." She pressed her hands together. "Tennis uncle, his uncle who had money. He said he would fund Victor's first business. One condition. Victor had to marry the daughter of his uncle's business partner. A proper family. A good match. The old way." Grace's chest ached. And Victor agreed. Abina's expression became complicated again. Grief and old anger braided together. He didn't agree. He refused. He told his uncle no. "He told me he would find another way." She sat back down. The chair creaked under the weight of everything. "But his uncle didn't wait for Victor to find another way. He came to me. He gave me money, more money than my parents had ever seen, and he told me to disappear. He told me that if I stayed, Victor's career would never happen. That is holding him back. that the baby would ruin him, and you believed him. I was 19. Grace, her mother's voice broke on the words. I was 19, and I had nothing, and this old man in a good suit told me the man I loved would be better without me. And I was afraid. I thought I was doing the right thing. Grace reached across the table and held her mother's. Hansei sat like that for a long time. The charcoal smoke drifted through the window. Somewhere, a child laughed. Grace thought about Victor Osei sitting in his penthouse above Lagos, alone. She thought about her mother selling Callowell for 30 years to raise children on her own. She thought about a check for 50 million naira that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with a lost man grasping at something he could not name. He had seen Grace's face, her mother's face, and something in him had broken open. He had not recognized what he was reaching for. But Grace now knew. The question was, what had Victor's uncle done with the money? And was the uncle still alive? And more importantly, had Victor ever truly stopped looking? Grace would find out. She was her mother's daughter. She knew how to work. She spent 3 days investigating quietly, carefully, the way she did everything. She went to the public records office and requested old business filings. She asked Madame Celestine carefully, casually, about the Osei family history. Madame Celestine, who loved to talk and loved to matter, told her plenty. Victor's uncle was a man named Reginald Osei Bonsu. He was 81 now, still alive. Living in a large house in East Legon, he had been the architect of Victor's early business loans, a fact Victor had always publicly credited with gratitude. He had arranged the marriage between Victor and a woman from a good family. That marriage had produced no children. Victor had later fallen in love with and married Amara, his second wife, who had died 4 years ago. Reginald Asabansu had shaped Victor's entire life. He had also, 30 years ago, paid a 19-year-old girl to vanish. But then Grace found the second thing, the thing that changed the temperature of the story completely. She was in the records office, cross-referencing old business documents, when she found a financial transfer, dated 30 years ago, a payment from a holding company linked to Reginald Asabansu to a property development firm, the same property development firm that had, 6 months later, submitted a fraudulent land title claim on a parcel of land in Kumasi, the same parcel of land that had once housed a tailor shop. Victor's father's tailor shop. Grace sat very still in the records office, surrounded by the smell of old paper and dust, and understood what she was looking at. Reginald Osei had not only paid Abina to disappear, he had arranged the destruction of Victor's father's business, ensuring that Victor had no fallback, no family safety net, no choice but to depend entirely on his uncle's money and his uncle's conditions. Victor had built his empire, believing his uncle had saved him. He did not know his uncle had first broken everything else. Grace needed to be certain before she moved. She needed one more witness. She found her in the last place she expected, Madame Celestine Boateng. It turned out had been 23 years old when all of this happened. She had been a distant family friend of the ASA household. She had no Adwoa. She had known Victor, and 30 years of guilt had made her, Grace now realized, oddly protective of the young woman who cleaned her house every Thursday, asking about her family, her dreams, her notebook of recipes, giving her extra money at Christmas, watching her with sad, careful eyes. When Grace came to her directly, Madame Celestine put down her tea. She looked at Grace for a long time. "You know," she said. "It was not a question. I know enough." Grace said, "I need you to tell me the rest." And Madame Celestine, at 73, with the weariness of a woman who had carried a secret for 3 decades, told her everything. Yes, she had seen Reginald pay a Benet. She had been in the next room. She had been too young and too frightened of the Asabanzu name to speak. And yes, she had known, somehow, that the quiet girl with the tailor shop boyfriend had carried something away when she disappeared, something that had grown up and cleaned houses and written recipes in a blue notebook and laughed with the clarity of someone who had never been told they were not enough. she had known, and she had said nothing. "I am sorry, child," Madame Celestine said. "I know," Grace said gently. "But now I need your testimony." Grace called Victor Osei. He answered on the first ring, which told her everything she needed to know about the state of his mind since their dinner. "I need to meet with you and your uncle," she said. "Together. Can you arrange that?" A pause. "My uncle." "Why?" "Because," Grace said, "there is something you deserve to know, and it concerns him." Victor's voice was careful when he answered. "What is this about, Miss Mensah?" "It is about Edouard," Grace said. "And it is about your father's tailor shop. And it is about me." 3 days later, she sat in a conference room on the 14th floor of the Osei Group Tower. The room smelled of leather and cold air conditioning. Victor sat at the head of the table. Beside him, Reginald Asabansu, 81 years old, white-haired, impeccably dressed in a dark agbada, sat with his hands folded and his face arranged in the expression of a man who had spent a lifetime being the most powerful person in every room. He looked at Grace. Something moved behind his eyes. A flicker. Recognition, perhaps, or fear, or both. Grace placed her folder on the table. She placed Madame Celestine's signed statement beside it. She placed the financial records beside that. "What is this?" Reginald said. His voice was deep, still, commanding, carrying the weight of authority that had never been seriously challenged. "My name is Grace Adwoa Mensah," Grace said. Her voice was steady, warm and steady, the way her mother had taught her, not through instruction, but through example. "I am the daughter of Abina Adwoa Mensah. 30 years ago, a woman by that name loved a man named Victor Osei. She was 19. She was carrying his child, and someone paid her to disappear." Victor made a sound, a small, strangled sound that had no name. Reginald said nothing. His hands tightened on the table. "That is a very dramatic claim," Reginald said quietly. "Yes," Grace agreed, "and I have the documentation to support all of it." She opened the folder. "This is the financial transfer from your holding company. This is Madame Celestine Boateng's witness statement. This is my birth record, listing my mother's full name as Adwoa Abina Mensah. And this," she placed a small, old photograph on the table, a copy of the one from Madame Celestine's mantelpiece, "is my mother and your nephew. 30 years ago, in front of his father's tailor shop." Victor's hand went to the photograph. He touched it the way a man touches something he thought was lost to him forever. Uncle Victor's voice was very quiet. "Did you know?" Reginald Asabansu lifted his chin.
"I did what was necessary." "You had ambitions, Victor."
"Real ambitions. That girl, her name Osedwoa," Victor said. "That situation would have buried you. A young man with no money, no family backing, a pregnant girlfriend from nothing. Do you think the Asante business families would have opened their doors? Do you think Kofi Darko would have given you the contract that started everything?" Reginald's voice was still steady, still the voice of authority. "I built you, Victor. You paid the woman I loved to disappear." Victor's voice was barely above a whisper now. "You took my child from me. I gave you an empire. You gave me 30 years without my daughter." Victor looked at Grace, really looked at her, for the first time without the desperate, confused, grasping energy of that first dinner. He looked at her with clarity, now, with recognition, with something breaking open in his chest that had been sealed for 30 years. Grace met his eyes. She felt her own eyes filled not with sadness, but with something more complex, the specific ache of a daughter who had spent her whole life continuing forward, not knowing what she had walked. "Hawaii. From, and the tailor shop," Grace said, turning back to Reginald. "Your holding company funded the firm that stole the land title from his father's property. Victor built his empire while his uncle was destroying the last thing his father had." Victor stood up. The room was very quiet. "Victor," Reginald began. "You will leave this building," Victor said. His voice had the quality of something final, of a door closing, of an era ending. "You will not return. Your name will be removed from the ASA Group board by end of day. My legal team will be in contact about the fraudulent land transaction, and the money you paid to drive away the mother of my child. I want every naira of it, documented and repaid." He paused. With 30 years of interest, Reginald rose slowly. He was still dignified, in the way of very old men who have never learned another way to be, but his hands, Grace noticed, were shaking. "I made you," he said. Victor looked at his uncle without hatred, just with the calm, clear gaze of a man who has finally seen something true. "No," Victor said, "you nearly cost me everything that mattered. The empire I built myself. Friends, if this story is moving you, please subscribe now. Click that bell. Because what comes next will change how you see everything." Reginald Asabansu walked to the door. He paused, with his hand on the frame. "You would not exist without me," he said. Grace spoke for the first time in several minutes. "He existed before you," she said quietly. "He existed in a tailor shop, with a father who loved him and a girl who loved him, and a life that was real. You didn't build him. You just bought the pieces that were left." Reginald left. The room was very, very quiet. Victor sat back down. For a long moment, he did not speak. He stared at the photograph on the table, his mother and a young man with nimble hands and plans. Then he looked at Grace. "I want to meet her," he said. "Adwawa. I want to see her." "She knows you're coming," Grace said. They drove to Eastern Accra in Victor's car. Not the Rolls-Royce, not the armored SUV, but a quiet, ordinary car that Victor drove himself, as if he understood instinctively that what was ahead of him required no armor. The neighborhood was alive with morning sounds. The Kellawell cart on the corner, the children in the compound, the smell of palm oil and smoke and something sweet and homemade. Victor parked and sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. Don't know what to say to her," he said. "You don't need to say anything first," Grace said. "Just let her see your face." They walked to the apartment. Grace knocked. Footsteps. The door opened. Abina Mensah stood in the doorway in her house dress and her wrapped hair. 67 years old, strong-handed, steady, and when she saw Victor Osei's face, she put one hand over her mouth and the other flat against the doorframe, as if she needed the wood to hold her upright. Victor looked at her, at the face he had looked for without knowing he was looking in every room he had entered for 30 years, in every quiet evening inn, a penthouse too large for one person, in every anniversary he had spent alone after Amara died. He said one word, "Adwoa," and Abina Mensah, who had not cried the morning after he disappeared from her life, who had said we continue and continued for 30 years and for children and a Kellawell cart and a tourum. Apartment Abina Mensah broke open. They held each other in the doorway of that small apartment while the neighborhood moved around them. And Grace stood a step back in the morning sun and let it happen. Let 30 years of loss and silence, an unknowing collapse, into this moment. She felt the tears on her own face and did not wipe them away. The OSA Group legal team moved quickly. After that, the fraudulent land records were submitted to the Economic Crimes Authority. Reginald Asabansu's assets tied to the transaction were frozen pending investigation. A press release from the USA Group board, newly restructured, confirmed that Reginald had been removed from all positions. The statement did not detail the reason. It did not need to. A DNA test confirmed what the photograph and the records and the living, standing truth of Grace's face had already told everyone. Victor Osei had a daughter. He said it to the press in the simplest possible words. Standing outside the ASA Group tower in Lagos, in front of the cameras that had always followed him for deals and announcements and quarterly reports, he said, "I have spent 30 years building things. I did not know that the most important thing I ever made was already here. Her name is Grace. and she is exactly that. He did not cry on camera, but in the footage, if you looked carefully, if you paused and looked, his eyes were wet. Year passed. The restaurant opened on a Tuesday in March. It was small, only 16 tables, in a clean, bright space in the eastern quarter of Accra, not far from the apartment where Grace had grown up. The sign above the door said it in warm orange letters. Inside, the walls were hung with photographs, a tailor shop in Kumasi, a young couple laughing outside it, a blue notebook, framed, open to a handwritten menu in careful script. Grace stood behind the pass on opening night, her apron tied, her hands moving with the calm efficiency of a woman who had been building toward this her entire life. The agusi soup was on, the jollof was on, the kelewel, her mother's recipe, exactly was on. Abina Mensah sat at the corner table, because Grace had refused to let her work. She sat with a look of complete and undisguised joy, watching her daughter move in her own kitchen with the authority of someone who had always been meant to be exactly here. Victor Osei had arrived at 7. He had asked to be a silent investor, one of Seberal, in the restaurant. He had also asked for the corner table by the window to always be reserved for Abina. Both requests had been honored. He sat across from Abina, and they talked the way people talk when they are still learning each other after 30 years, carefully, with long pauses, with the awareness that time is not infinite, and they have already spent too much of it apart. They were not in love anymore. They had been two different lives for too long, but they were something more durable than love. Now, there were two people who shared the best thing either of them had ever made. Grace came out at the end of the night. She sat with them. The restaurant was quiet around them, the last guests gone, the kitchen cooling. "How do you feel?" Victor asked her. Grace looked around at the photographs on the walls, at her mother's face, at the blue notebook in its frame, all the dreams she had written in cramped, careful handwriting in taxi rides and on lunch breaks, and late at night with a lamp that flickered. "Like I always knew this was possible," she said. "I just didn't know why." Reginald Asabansu faced criminal proceedings for the land fraud. At 81, the courts moved slowly, but they moved. He was removed from every board, every committee, every institution that had once been proud to name him as a patron. He lived in the East Legan house, which grew quieter as the year went on, as the people who had gathered there for his power found other rooms to gather in. He was not a broken man. Men like him did not break easily, but he was a diminished one. And Ecno Italiano Madame Celestin came to the restaurant every Friday. She always ordered the kelewel first. And Grace, who had laughed instead of been bought. Grace, who had folded a 50 million naira check and asked the right question instead. Grace, who had built her dream coin by coin in a blue notebook. While the world moved around her, Grace learned something that year that she already knew in her bones, but now knew in her history too. That dignity is not something anyone can offer you with a check. It is the thing you carry with you into every room, the thing that survives every abandoned drawer and absent name, and quiet morning when you square your shoulders and say, "We continue." It is the thing that, in the end, finds its way home. The man who had tried to buy her found, instead, that she had given him back something beyond all price. Not a night, not an evening, a daughter, a history, a reason to understand that everything he had built had been pointing all along, not toward the gold letters on a tower, but toward a small restaurant with 16 tables and warm orange letters above. The door and the smell of his mother's recipes drifting out into the evening air of Accra. The woman who had everything taken from her finally understood that nothing taken from her had ever truly been hers to lose, because Grace had always been there. Continuing. Thank you, friends, for joining us for this story. If it moved you, if it made you feel something real, please subscribe to our channel and click the bell so you never miss a story like this one. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And when you are ready, our next story is waiting for you right here. We will see you there.